Okay, so this is actually applying ethics. So this is the techniques that you use as a researcher to ensure you're within the boundaries and constraints of being ethical. The concept is that if we follow a set of rules, we're going to be ethical. I think it's interesting. And I also think that's open for debate. Okay, so the first one is make sure you get consent. Now, that's what you guys are going to be doing for Assessment D. Your participants will sign a piece of paper that literally says, I give consent. Okay, legally, I must have that piece of paper because if things go wrong, I'm not legally covered unless they've signed that piece of paper because I'm legally liable for what you do, heaven help me. So, the problem with this one, of course, is that if you're doing observation, do you want the people to know you're observing them? Okay, you're not participating today. Excellent. So the problem is in observation, when you have people and you observe them, they change their behaviour. Practice it in a cafe. Be really obvious when you're doing some people watching. Make sure they know that you're watching them and they will change their behaviour. It's hysterically funny. I find it needlessly entertaining. So the problem is if you go up and say, I'm going to observe you. Can I get you to sign this piece of paper for consent, please? Thanks. And then walk away. They're going to go, what the... So, problem already. So ethically, you can do non-participant observation without getting consent, even though step one of being ethical is ensuring you've got consent. Yes? Yeah, okay, Cameron, good question about what is the higher need of consent or data. My answer is, well, it depends. All right. Number two, minimise the risk of harm. Okay, so you're not going to do interviews in the middle of a highway. All right, I say this because I kid you not, I was driving down the parkway the other day and there was somebody in the middle of the highway on their phone, standing in, anyway. So, don't do interviews in the middle of the highway. Kind of obvious, but it's really interesting how many people do interviews in really weird spots. Really weird spots. Somebody was doing an interview yesterday in the Refec when it was packed at a full table. Now, it wasn't a research interview, it was a work interview, like not for a job, but they were eliciting data. So, the atmosphere was not right, the person's not at ease, and she was clearly uncomfortable, and he was really quite officious, like very official, in a setting that was casual. So already you're starting to create some really mixed signals about what you're doing. So how good was his data? Not good, I would say, all right? Now, this is a hard one. The textbook does quite a nice example on protecting anonymity. So my research, if I ever get it to the publishers, the people who I've quoted in it will be able to read their quotes and know that that was their quote. They'll see themselves in it, even though I've called them respondent 21 and respondent 4, because I've numbered my respondents. But they will see themselves in it. Now, the trick is to make sure that the evidence that you use in your write-up is sufficiently obscure enough that they're not going to recognise someone else. So this is where it starts to get murky. So I had to, for my research, I had to sanitise my transcripts before I sent them to my colleague for reading. But of course, one of the people I interviewed was actually his colleague. So of course, when he read her transcript, he could easily identify her because of what she was talking about. So the process is quite particular for that university. So he knew her transcript, so he now knows everything that she said. Now it's okay because he's on the ethics application, so we're covered ethically. But if I'd used a third researcher, which you can do, you can employ third researchers, all right, and you just say on your ethics application, we'll be employing a third researcher at some point, all right, what if they'd recognised? So you might think it's really easy to do anonymous, but sometimes it's really not, depending on what your data is. So it's a real balance about what you do there as a researcher and how you handle that and what you do with it. Okay? I just have to hope that nobody works out who respondent number 4 is in my research. Anyway, we'll find out. Deceptive practices. Okay, so Milgram in his experiment, he actually advertised for memory. This is an experiment on memory, but it wasn't at all. It was an out-and-out lie. You cannot deceive the people that you are interviewing or watching or whatever it is that you're doing with them, surveying, focus grouping. All right, you can't. You just can't. You can't lie to them. Could in the old days. It was great fun. Can't now. Okay, so even Goffman lies to them when he turns up on their front doorstep. So Goffman in the tea room trade does this weird observation, which you'll read about, and then he went back a year later and interviewed people on a health survey questionnaire, and he was actually asking about their sex life. Okay, so it's just this interesting deception thing that we used to be allowed to do that we're not allowed to do anymore. But you also don't want to tell them what you're actually researching, because then they'll feel obliged to give you the answers you want. So you've got to be honest enough about the research that you're doing to get them on the right path that you want them to take, but not too honest that they then just start giving you the data that they think that you want instead of the data that they actually have. See how murky ethics is, right? Like, this is not a clear-cut black and white thing. It really impacts your data. Okay, I would love to do deceptive research just quietly, because people lie, and the more I can deceive them at the outset, the less lies I'm going to get. Personal perspective, on record, damn. Okay, right, and people can always withdraw. People can always bail. Okay, in the interviews that I did, I had a woman who tried desperately hard to bail because she actually didn't want to do the interview in the first place, but she had to, because, you know, fun times. And she tried to bail halfway through. I quietly negotiated it so that she didn't bail because I really wanted her data. Because if they bail, you then got two choices. You have to explicitly ask them, appreciate that you don't want to participate in the interview anymore. Do I have your permission to use the data I already have? And then they can say no. And at that point, you've wasted an hour of your life, or half an hour of your life, because you've just lost all that data. And if you use it, you are in breach of all sorts of ethical stuff. All right? But again, if you're doing a non-participant observation and people don't even know they're participating in research, then how on earth can they possibly withdraw from research? The push, those people who were in the experiment didn't know they were in the experiment. Interestingly, they'd given consent to the experiment. Okay, so the guy who, I forgot his name already, Brown, he had got them to give consent to participate in one of his shows. They just didn't know that that scenario was one of his shows. So technically he had consent from them to participate in his research, but they didn't ever have the option to withdraw. And that's where it starts to get tricky. All right? And it's so unethical on so many levels. But basically, if you follow those techniques, you should be ethical. That's the idea.
So with the minimise the risk of harm to participants, would that also be like if you're doing, I don't know, like childhood trauma or something, you wouldn't ask a question that's going to like set them back and stuff like that?
Yeah, okay. And these are the vulnerable groups I was talking about. So when you're interviewing vulnerable groups, the chances of you getting a vulnerable groups interview thing through ethics these days is so limited. Because, and I'm getting to it, but because ethics committees are really risk averse. And I suspect if you were doing that, there'd be all sorts of rules and regulations that come across it. I mean, my favourite ethics application that I got told about was somebody who was interested in how children engage with play equipment, and you know, was trying to improve. You know, they were in the sort of the architect design space, and they wanted to change how it worked. And so his ethics application was, can I please go and hide in the bushes at the local playground and observe children on the playground equipment? That was a legitimate ethics application. Knocked back, because creepy dude in the bushes. But you can see how, but he would have got amazing data. Because the problem is to observe children in a playground, he has to declare, there has to be signs up saying this playground is observation for research purposes. You know, all that sort of stuff, which means parents will then go, oh, well, we're not going to be here today. You know, Or if they tell their children, oh, you're being observed for research purposes, the children will change behaviour for a period of time. Children are great because they will quickly go back to being children. All right? But yeah, you're right. The vulnerable groups are really, really tricky to get data from. And of course, that means we don't do research on them. And yet they're probably one of the groups that we need to do the most research on in order to understand how to most help them. But we can't because ethics won't let us. All right? Okay. Okay, so for assessment D, let's have a quick chat about this. What you're going to do, you're going to complete the form and you're going to do that tricky walking of the line of this is what our research is about, but I'm not really going to tell you what our research is about because if I tell you what the research is about, then you're not going to behave the way I want. But you do have to tell them what you're going to ask them questions about. So you have to say, I'm going to ask you questions about this because they've got to be prepared to make that informed choice. It's got to be an informed choice. So again, you're going to work out, you know, this is good. For those of you who want to join the APS, the public service, this is great practice. How to say what you need to say without saying what you really need to say. Okay? 13 years of my life. All right. Now, you don't have to go to a committee, but I do need to see, I will see in your tutorial groups, I will see that piece of paperwork. I'm not letting you loose on interviews without seeing it. Okay? Then what will happen is you'll go to your interview and you'll say to the person, you need to read this piece of paper and you need to give them time to read it. Then you need to say, if you agree, you need to sign this consent and then you witness it. It's okay that you're witnessing because all you're doing is verifying that they signed it in your presence. Okay? So then you get that consent form. And then you have to say, when you're talking to them, where was I going with that last dot point? So this is the link between the data that makes you uncomfortable is about now your harm. So when you're interviewing, they've signed off that they're going to talk to you about political views, and this actually has happened. I'll use the example. This has happened. They were interviewing about social drinking, so not drinking to excess or anything like that. And this person had chosen a candidate working on the assumption that they were a drinker. And so they went in and they said, oh, you know, sign forms. Yeah. So, you know, how often do you drink? I don't. Well, this is going to be the shortest interview ever. No, but I use a lot of drugs and I thought I'd talk to you about that. And she just went, well, now what do I do? Okay, so this was actually a close personal friend of hers and she didn't know they were a drug user. And so then she spent 20 minutes getting good data about their drug use. But she was really uncomfortable. Now, she said to me afterwards, she said, it's great data. I said, yeah, she's great data. I said, but how's the friendship going? And she said, it's all weird now. And it's like, yeah. So you need to pull out. If you're in a situation in an interview where you're uncomfortable, you need to say, look, I really appreciate the time you've given me so far today, but I'm uncomfortable at this point in time, so I'm not sure that I'm getting the data I need. So I think we might just pull the pin. You don't have to say you're uncomfortable. You know, I'm not getting the data I need, or look, you know, this has not gone the direction I thought it would. You know, oh, look, I've stuffed up the interview. My tutor told me this might happen. I've corrupted the data. I can't use it. Really sorry. Can't do it. And then you have to find someone else. In real life, of course, when people start giving you information that they don't need, like this woman that I had that was getting angry, I'm pretty easygoing, so I just went, yeah, whatever, here we go. All right? But you need to be conscious about what makes you uncomfortable. What data are people going to give you that you're going to go, ick? All right? Which is why I don't agree with Albert Einstein. I think ethics is relative. Ethics is about what each of us personally have boundaries and find acceptable. What makes you uncomfortable? What makes them uncomfortable? What makes me uncomfortable? All right? And what's corrupting your data? Okay, so we come back to this data question. So my problem is that I actually think ethics is quite relative and I think it's quite murky and grey, and there are many people who probably don't, agree with me on that. But anyway, that's kind of the way it is.